Chapter 6 Tunnel for Tunnel. Throughout the city of Crowhaven, a public service announcement system had been installed some years previously. It had never been used very often, but when the familiar sound of bells echoed through the city, it would often send everyone running outside to listen carefully to whatever was about to be said. The vintage speakers were still hanging on every corner streetlight. They were like something out of a storybook in appearance. Often when they would ring, it would turn out to be something about a fugitive being caught or killed, almost as if it was a warning to people, considering a stance against Pandora or elite industries. Milo hadn't given much thought to these relics of the past in quite some time, until that damn bell rang out over the system and brought the group's attention to the nearest street pole. Alice jumped at the sound and cowered behind Dexter and Milo as they stepped forward to listen.
This is Governor Cephas Pandora. I wish to inform you all that the train tunnels are strictly off limits to all unauthorized citizens, and are heavily guarded to prevent your entrance. Anyone who dares to defy and enter the tunnels shall be mercilessly slaughtered. That is all.
Dexter broke out in laughter at it and held his hair back as he giggled. Milo closed his eyes in thought and placed a hand on his pistol. What the hell was that nonsense? Could he have been any more specific, do you think? Dexter was still laughing as he spoke. We're still going in there, said Milo flatly. What? Asked Alice. Milo just shook his head and held up a finger. He knew that the tunnels were the only way. The train was the only option available. We have to get a train. There's no other path. Nothing else would get us there. Dexter looked as if he were about to explode into a fit of rage, but he stopped himself and sat back down. Fine then, if you think so. It's not going to be easy, and I hope you realize that. Pandora isn't joking when he says it's guarded. There are probably more machine guns in there than above ground, if not a bunch of even worse things. Alice had stood up and was turning her head from one to the other as Milo and Dexter continued debating what to do. She looked as if she wanted to join in, but they were talking too quickly for her to butt her way into the conversation. I know that, of course I do. But we'll just have to plan. Maybe we can find more guns and bullets. Milo looked at his bags. We may have to lose some things too, so that we can move quickly. Dex nodded and looked at his gun. He brushed it a bit with his shirt and turned back towards Milo. I'll start looking then, he said before standing and walking into the first building he came across. Milo watched him for a moment before turning to Alice. She was looking at him with a blank stare that made him uncomfortable. Are you okay with this? He asked her. What? She started as she shook herself. Oh, yes. Milo gave her a questioning look but shrugged it off. She stood up and began searching a nearby corner. He too began looking through various boxes that had scattered themselves around the street. He wasn't sure that they'd find anything worthwhile, but he held some degree of hope that they might stumble upon something useful, in some small way. The streets were covered in garbage here, and with every old newspaper that he tossed aside, Milo became a bit more concerned for the decision he had made. He knew Dexter and Alice weren't happy about it, and now he was growing unsure of himself. Dexter had always followed behind Milo blindly in whatever decision he made. It had always just sort of fell in that way, with Dexter allowing Milo to lead them into some stupid ideas. Once, when they were around 10 years old, Milo had led them away from their neighborhood to see the wall around District 17. They only managed to get a few blocks away from home before they were caught by Dexter's parents, but the adventure had been an exciting one just the same. Dexter had never voiced his opinion against Milo this entire trip, not even when they were chased by a very deranged-looking cat that at the time had seemed the size of a small lion, and not when a large pile of rubble fell from the top of a building, quite mysteriously. He never complained when they were later caught, and Dexter shared the blame, even though Milo had been the proprietor of the venture. As the years went on, it all began to change slowly. Dex began voicing his opinion when he didn't agree with things Milo said or did. The older they got, the more Dex began to stay behind, while Milo went off and did something stupid. After Milo's mom was killed, things really changed. Dexter first went into a complete halt. He refused to join Milo in anything, and they would often fight about things that weren't even that important. Then Milo's father vanished and their friendship nearly fell apart. It hadn't really recovered completely, and that had been another factor in Milo's long avoidance of the hotel before the night he stayed there. He was hurt, knowing that he was losing his friend to time. "I found a ton of shit!" shouted Dexter as he came back outside with a large box in his hands, full of bullets and food. Milo smiled and looked through everything. Not all the ammunition would work in their guns, but most of it worked out. The food was even better. "This was all in that house?" he asked Dex. "Yeah, in the basement. I didn't want to go down there at first because it was all dark and creepy, but I found a candle and lit it. There's all sorts of neat shit down there, Milo, like old pinball machines and baseball stuff." Dexter was clearly more excited about the pinball machines than Milo or Alice was. But Milo laughed and looked up to see Alice coming back down the road with a handful of stuff of her own. She sat it down next to Dexter's box and shook her head. "It's all I could find." There were batteries and matches. She had also managed to find some ink pens and an empty notepad. She then paused and pulled something out of her back pocket. It was a walkie-talkie. "I couldn't find the other one, though, so it's useless." She hung her head, but Dexter gasped and began digging to the bottom of his own box to pull out another walkie-talkie. "I found the other one by the front window inside," he said. Milo couldn't have been happier. He began dividing everything amongst them and left Dexter with one of the radios while he kept the other. He figured Alice would always end up with one of the two boys, and she agreed, albeit not with some persuading. "So, will this be enough to get us through to find a train?" she asked Milo, with a doubtful look shining in her beautiful eyes. "It's gonna have to be," said Dexter in a voice that was trying to convey false comfort. "Isn't that right, Milo?" Milo nodded his head one time. He was more confident than he had been, but nothing could get him to shake the worry in his heart. He had no idea what would be waiting for them in the tunnels, and he couldn't lie to his friends and say that they'd be fine. He wasn't sure that they would be okay. He wasn't even sure they would make it back out alive. "Come on," he said. "Let's move." The entrance to the subway certainly looked plain enough. Just a simple stairway on the sidewalk that led down into the station, with a large sign that hung overhead. The tiles on the wall were yellow and dry rotting. Some had fallen and shattered on the ground, leaving small bits of dust and rock that crushed under the trio's feet as they carefully placed every step. Milo and Alice took the left side of the entrance, while Dexter pressed himself against the right side. They all had their guns drawn and were keeping their eyes open for any sign of opposition. They peeked around the corner and scouted up and down the station for the machine guns they had grown accustomed to finding. Milo couldn't see anything, and Dexter expressed the same from his side. "What do we do?" he asked Milo. Milo held up his hand and motioned for them to continue around the wall and into the subway system. Dexter took a deep breath and shook his head before stepping out into the open. He held his gun up and turned both directions as Milo flew out from the other side and did the same. Alice joined them with trepidation. She held up her own gun and hovered closely to them as they stood there in the middle of the large empty train station. Their very breath seemed to hang in the room, and the long, strange silence made Milo's fingers quiver. They began moving down the platform slowly and checking around every wall and blockade that could have been hiding a gun or a guard. When Milo heard the whirring sound of an engine, however, he knew it wasn't a machine gun. At least, it wasn't like any that he had seen before, if it was. Still, he quickly shouted for everyone to take cover, and they leapt behind a very large teller's desk. From the tunnel on the opposite end of the station, there was what appeared to be a mounted gun with miniature helicopter propellers on either side. It was flying over the tracks, and a green-lighted motion detector was scanning the platform as it went. Its sights landed on the desk they were hiding behind, and the light turned red. It began shooting, and the steel desk became indented with bullet-shaped pings. Alice let out a scream, and Milo put his hand over her mouth, though he had almost shouted himself. Dexter, on the other hand, was keeping calm and collected as he leaned out from the side of the desk and began firing at the flying gun. Milo suspected that shooting the gun wouldn't work. Quickly, he grabbed Dexter's attention. "The propellers!" he yelled. "The propellers!" Dex smiled broadly and leaned around the corner for one final shot, straight at the left propeller. It hit directly and the flying gun went crashing into the ground, sending bullets in every direction as it went. It fell apart and the light went out. But they were far from being safe. In the distance, they could hear the whirring of many more motors, so Milo quickly leapt from behind the desk and began leading them down the tunnel. He was running as hard as he could and could only hope that the others were doing the same. The lights along the station seemed to be flickering at an incredibly high rate, and it made Milo dizzy. It reminded him of strobe lights and fireworks, but he shook it off and kept running. He could hear the guns behind him, but he couldn't guess how far back they were, so he never slowed down to look. Then he could hear shooting start, and turned around to realize that the tunnel behind him was dark, and that he could see nothing in the blackness. Alice and Dexter were nowhere to be found. He paused to consider what he should do, but then he turned and kept running towards the flickering lights, now aware that they were shutting off as he ran. Every step he could feel the lights blinking out behind him. Every step he could hear the guns catching up with him, and the entire time he had no idea whether he was leaving his friends behind to die, or if their bodies were somewhere far behind him, already dead. But then he saw it. Like a vision from a childhood dream come true, there was a train on the tracks. It was just sitting there as if it had been waiting for him all his life, as if it had been placed there at exactly the right spot for this exact moment in time. Milo felt his steps quicken as he got closer, and when he stepped up and pulled the door open to go inside, he felt his heart flutter with hope. He quickly shut it behind himself and hid below the windows in fear of the guns finding him. But they passed him by. They seemed to take no notice of him as they quickly sped down the course of the tunnel. Quickly, he stood up and began walking through the train cars, going from one to another until he found the engine and examined the control board. He wasn't sure how to run a train, he suddenly realized, and he nearly punched the wall as he dropped down in frustration. He had almost forgotten that his friends were still missing, and it pissed him off even more to remember it. He hated himself for forgetting it and couldn't understand why he had. He gathered his thoughts and his courage and stood back up. He nearly fell back over at the sight he could see outside of the train. It was the shadow that had been following them from before. It appeared and disappeared in the blink of an eye, but he had seen it. He pulled out his gun and began a quick run back to the end of the train, but he couldn't see the shadow anymore. It was gone. What he did see, however, was Alice, running down the tracks with a face filled with fright. She grabbed onto him and began sobbing. He hugged her tightly and looked her in the eyes. "Where is Dexter?" he asked in great fear of the answer. "They're coming. They'll just be a minute," she said in a near state of panic. Milo thought about it for a moment, and then grabbed her by the shoulders. What do you mean, they?" he asked. But he could see them coming up behind her now. Dexter was being held up by Victor Gamble, who was looking even shabbier than he had the previous time Milo had run into him. But it was Dex that caught Milo's immediate attention. His pants were bloody from the knee down, and the bullet wound in his shin was spitting more blood onto them with every step. Milo quickly hopped down from the train and helped Victor get Dex inside. They placed him on the floor of the train and gathered around him. Dex was moaning and seemed to be barely aware of his surroundings. Victor looked at Milo with a hard gaze and spoke slowly. "I need something to wrap his leg with. Go." And with that, he bent over Dexter's leg and began cutting a hole in the pants large enough to easily get to the wound. Milo's first instinct was to grab Victor and push him away, but he restrained himself and began hunting for a wrapping of some sort. He found a closet at the front of the car and found a towel that he deemed suitable. By the time he got back to Victor and Dexter, the bullet had been pulled out, and Victor had cleaned around the hole. He was now stitching it up while Dex grunted in pain. "Will that be enough?" asked Milo in surprise. "I know secrets that come in handy for this sort of thing. Let's leave it at that." Alice looked at Milo suspiciously, and back to Victor even more so. The long black hair that hung down into Victor's face made Milo wonder how he could even see what he was doing. After he finished stitching the wound, He took the towel that Milo had found and tied it around the area. Dex sat up and winced as he did. "You won't be much use as far as walking goes until tomorrow. Then you'll be fine." Milo looked at Victor in shock. He had never heard of a bullet wound being healed overnight. "How can you be so sure? That doesn't make sense," he said violently. Victor smirked and brushed his hair back before pulling up his own black pants to reveal a rag he had wrapped around a wound of his own. He peeled the wrapping away and pointed to the remains of a hole that wasn't there anymore. "That was in the same state as your friend's wound a few days ago," he said as Milo gaped at it in amazement. Suddenly something dawned on Milo that made him angry and terrified at the same time. "You've been following us," he said quietly. "You've been shot," he continued a bit louder. "Yes," was all that Victor said. Milo looked at Dexter and shook his head in shame. "Don't you see?" he asked Dex as he looked on. "He's the shadow we've been seeing everywhere. He's the shadow that we shot that day." Alex suddenly gave Victor the sort of look that would kill, if looks could do such a thing. But he just stood there and nodded his head in agreement. Milo pulled out his gun and held it an arm's length away from Victor's face. He never flinched and didn't look away. "What do you want with us?" asked Milo. "Give me one good reason that I shouldn't just kill you where you stand and be done with it." Victor lowered his eyebrows, and the corners of his lips turned up so subtly that Milo barely noticed it. "I just saved your friend's life while you kept running and left him behind. Why should they trust you?" he said as he waved a pale hand at Alice and Dexter. "Not to mention, you need me to drive this train, since you have no inkling of an idea on how to do it yourself." Milo lowered his gun and let out a loud yell in resentment. "You know how to drive the train?" asked Alice in a hoarse whisper. "I do. Yes." Milo passed Victor and knelt by Dexter to examine the bullet wound. He grabbed his own hair and tugged slightly before turning back to Victor. "Then go and get us moving. We can't stay here forever." Victor bowed his head and took off towards the engine of the train. Alice looked down at Milo and smiled. "I think you did the right thing." "I hope you're right, because I'm not nearly so sure."